pick up on that. Okay. So now and ultimately, what is it saying? What it's saying is that a Jew is a selfless being. A Jew is an egoless person. A Jew's identity in his core is egoless, which is why a Jew is never comfortable in his own skin, in his or her own skin. That's why a Jew is always trying to make a revolution, which is why most psychologists are Jewish and most of their patients are Jewish. A Jew is dealing with some kind of existential angst. There's a problem with a Jew. And what's the problem? Existence is a problem. Existence is a problem. The essence of a Jew, the identity of a Jew is nothingness, is oneness with God. Just like a candle is always flickering, it's always trying to go back to its source, even though it will lose its identity. If it goes to its source, it will disappear. But it's super rational. That's all it wants. It's connected to its source. That's why a soul is also referred to as such. And the Alter Rebbe writes over there in the end of the first chapter of Tanya, he says that it's not a crazy novelty to say that non-Jews ultimately do everything for themselves. Because he says everything in the world ultimately does everything for themselves. That's what it means to be part of the world. The whole world is called a klipa, a shell. Why is it a shell? Because it's concealing over the true identity. You think that you have a separate identity besides for the godly force and energy which brings you into existence. And that in itself is, so therefore a horse, for example, which is not kosher, anything which is not kosher, right? So a horse is also, comes from this same place. No one thinks a horse is evil. That's why people get confused. People read some Kabbalistic texts, even this first chapter of Tanya, and they get very confused. They say, is it derogatory? Is it putting down non-Jews? What they don't realize is when the Alter Rebbe is writing, when it says in the text that the non-Jews are like this, it's not saying that they're bad like the way we call bad. Bad means, in our lexicon, bad means you're a rapist. Bad means you're a murderer. Bad means you're a ganif. That's what bad means. Here, that's not what I mean. No one thinks that a horse is evil, is bad. No one thinks that it murders anyone, that it does anything wrong. That's not what the problem. The problem is the ego. The problem is the separation from God. Says Rab Meir Abu Laifa, in explanation of this Gemara, that's what the Gemara means. That it doesn't matter what a Jew says, why he's doing it. Ultimately, whatever he's doing, he's trying to get away from existence. He's trying, and even if he doesn't understand why he's doing it, he says ultimately, he's doing it in order to be connected to his Creator, to lose himself. So now, that's one point. I'm going to make a few points about the Gemara we learned, because we read through the Gemara, now let's make a few points. In the verse that we're looking at, it says, Tzedakah tereimim goy, tzedakah uplifts a nation, b'chesed l'umim chatos. And chesed is a sin for the people, for the peoples, for the nations. Why does it change the terminology, the term, from tzedakah to chesed? So the Maharal mi Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Landau from Prague says an unbelievable explanation. And this explanation is very relevant to a lot of things. And he says that tzedakah, people mistranslate basically tzedakah as philanthropy or as charity. He says that's not what it is. Tzedakah means righteousness. Tzedek v'yosher, justice, righteousness, for the sake of truth, for the sake of what's right versus wrong. So he says the term that the pasuk itself uses is precise. That by a Jewish person, why does he give tzedakah? Because it's the just thing to do. He's not giving tzedakah. He's not giving tzedakah. The money was given to him in order to give tzedakah. It's a deposit. But you understand that the tzedakah is righteousness. It's not philanthropy. It's not kindness. It's not kindness. It's not about I'm such a kind, loving person. I already have 3-4 homes. I already have a private jet. What am I going to do with my money anyways? Let me see if I could make a name for myself. Throw out the money. That's not what it is. Tzedakah is righteousness. Which, by the way, is why we find that those who give tzedakah when they have no money will give tzedakah when they have money. And those who didn't give tzedakah when they had no money, it doesn't matter how much money they end up getting. It makes no difference. Hundreds of millions, billions. They also still won't be giving any money. The concept, they don't, because either tzedakah is justice, is righteousness, tzedek v'yosher, in the words of the Maharal of Prague, or it's chesed. So that's what the pasuk says. How's the pasuk conclude? V'chesed le'umim chatos. That by the umis ha'olam, it's not called tzedakah. It's called kindness. It's called philanthropy. It's a different concept. A person is going beyond the letter of the law, out of the kindness of their heart. It's so benevolent of them that they're giving tzedakah. And why does tzedakah exalt the nation? Tzedakah teroimein goy, it exalts the nation. And that's a concept we spoke about at length many, many times over the course of this Yaakov class, which is one of the concepts that we discussed, which is that tzedakah turns a person into a godlike person. Just like God is a giver, we become a giver. We become an extension of God. We become godlike. This is our way of becoming godlike. Instead of being a receiver, we become a giver. And this uplifts us, exalts us in a way that's very difficult to find, even within other mitzvahs. It's very difficult to find this level of being so exalted and being able to reach such a tremendous, tremendous level. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, in a talk that he gave in 1992, which is the last year that we got to hear from the Rebbe spoke then that when non-Jews give tzedakah and they help out the Jewish people because they realize that they're supposed to be helping out the Jewish people and that it's the right thing to help out the Jewish people, and that one of the greatest things that a non-Jew could do is to be a blessing to the Jewish people, then by definition, it's not a sin. The problem is when it's kindness. So the Rebbe said basically a very similar word, a very similar idea to the Maharal of Prague. The sin is when it's chesed. The pasuk said, "V'chesed le'umim chatos." When the nations do chesed, do kindness, then it's a sin. But when they do it because they're messengers of God, they're emissaries of God, to use their power, influence, money for the right causes, that's not a sin. That's not a sin. Now it's interesting to note, and I don't fully have the answer to this, that despite what the Gemara says that for Jews it's different and whatnot, if you open up the code of Jewish law, Shulchan Aruch, chapter 369, the first section of Shulchan Aruch, the second section of Shulchan Aruch, Yeridea, chapter 369, Reish Samach Tes, the Shulchan Aruch brings down the 8 levels of giving charity that we once discussed. There's 8 levels. You set the person up on their feet and so on and so forth. The lowest level is where you give not what the person needs, less than what they need. You just give them something, and you do it with a depressed face. You don't do it with a smile and countenance. That's level number 8, the lowest level. That's quoted over there in the Shulchan Aruch. And then the Ramah writes the following. The Ramah is considered part of the Shulchan Aruch. Basically, the Shulchan Aruch was written by the Beis Yosef, by the Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who was a Sephardi, and the Ashkenazim felt a little left out because of their customs and their traditions, and what happens if they argue with the opinion sometimes of the Sephardim. So the Ramah wrote a book called the Mappa, the tablecloth, and really the way he wrote it is not a separate book. Within the Shulchan Aruch, he writes notes, and sometimes he'll continue the sentence of the Shulchan Aruch with his note. So it's part of the Shulchan Aruch. Any Shulchan Aruch in the world will have the Ramah. So over there, if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, interestingly enough, based on our Gemara, the Ramah writes the following: that the loy, I'm going to quote him in the Hebrew and translate. The al kol panim loy yisba'er ha'adam b'tzedakah shenaising. A person should not pride himself, be arrogant and proud with the tzedakah that he is giving. And v'im mispa'er, if he is mispa'er, if he does become arrogant and take pride, loy dayoy she'enei mekabel schar ela afilu manishim oisei elehu. It's not enough that he doesn't receive reward to even punish him over this act. A shocking statement brought in the Code of Jewish Law. And like I said, I don't fully have the explanation here, because ultimately, do it for the wrong reasons, just get it done. I'm just showing you that there's even a halachic ramification of this idea of our Gemara. That's how strong the idea is. Of course, I don't believe that he's suggesting don't give the money. That's not what it is. He's saying that it's a shame. It's a shame. You're giving the money anyways. May as well do it for the right reason. In other words, you could do an act, but if the whole act is just an extension of your ego, why do you even deserve reward for something like that? If it would have been a sin, you would have done it with just the same relish. It's all about your ego. So it's a shame in a way. You're giving the money. You may as well recognize that this money is stuck. Don't walk around with pride and so on. Just a suggestion. But anyways, that's the Shulchan Aruch, the ramification of this halacha. However, ultimately the law is, like we quoted and like our very own Gemara quotes, that a person who gives tzedakah for ulterior motives, that he should go to, that he should merit the world to come, or that his son should get better. Ulterior motives is okay. Not only is it okay, the person is a completely righteous person. It's a positive thing. In a moment, I'll actually give what I believe is the real explanation of this ruling of the Code of Jewish Law, why it doesn't contradict the principle of that we believe that ulterior motives is okay, and eventually you'll do it for the right reasons. It's actually a brilliant explanation given by the Panim Yafis, which seemingly would explain it. We'll get to that in a moment, but before that, it's interesting, it's important to note that this idea that it's okay to do a mitzvah for ulterior motives is not only by the mitzvah of tzedakah. I could have thought specifically by tzedakah, because tzedakah, what matters is that the poor person should get his money. No. It applies to all mitzvahs, and there's the proof explicitly from the Talmud in the tractate of Psachim, Daf Ches, where the Gemara over there says, doesn't matter the context, it's talking about you're doing b'dikas chametz, that even if you're doing b'dikas chametz, and while you're doing b'dikas chametz, you're checking for chametz, you're finding money that was lost in a hole. The whole story of it. What if there's a non-Jewish neighbor? But the bottom line that comes out over there, the Gemara quotes this quote, that if you give money to tzedakah for the sake of ulterior motives, it's still harei tzad gomer, you're a completely righteous person. And the Gemara over there uses it over there. You're doing b'dikas chametz, you're checking for chametz, so we see that it's not specific to tzedakah. It's a wrong assumption to make that you do it for tzedakah. But if so, my dear friends, why did it give the example of tzedakah? The answer is because every mitzvah, the main thing about the mitzvah is that this is the will of the Almighty, of God. However, in addition to that, every mitzvah has what we call a skula miyuchedes, a particular power and energy in this world that it helps for. Which is why there are 248 commandments corresponding to the 248 limbs of the body. And so too in the world at large. Every mitzvah has its particular quality that it accomplishes. For example, famously, tefillin protects the Jewish people. It causes the fear of God to be on the nations of the world, which is why the Rebbe came out before the 6-Day War with the crazy campaign, to get everyone to put on tefillin, and of course it continues to be a campaign. But the particular power of tefillin, according to the Gemara, is that it protects the Jewish people and it causes the nations to fear the Jewish people. That's the power of tefillin. So in this Gemara as well, it's the same concept. The person says, I want my son to live. What's the best way for your son to live? To give someone else life. This is the greatest proof. This is actually a very strong proof to that concept. That every mitzvah has its power and that energy, and that's why specifically they do that mitzvah. There's a famous Gemara in the Tractate of Menachos where it says that echad hamarbe, the echad hamamit, whether you give a lot, whether you do a lot, whether you bring a big sacrifice, whether you bring a small sacrifice, the main thing is your heart, the Jewish heart. It's a famous piece of Gemara. A person says, I have a Jewish heart. That's where it's from, really, from this statement. Hashem is not asking for big. Whether you give a lot, whether you give a little, the main thing is your heart. But there's a statement from the Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov says that three things, it's the exact opposite. That what? That whether you're supposed to read the Gemara like this, the opposite for these three things. Whether you have intent of the heart, whether you don't have intent of the heart, the main thing is to give a lot. The main thing is a lot. In other words, all that matters ultimately is the action. What are the three things? It's a very famous quote from the Baal Shem Tov. What are the three things? So he says one of them is the recital of Zohar, the holy book of Zohar, that it purifies a person's neshama. It gives them a sense of spiritual sensitivity, of transcendence. The recital of Tehillim, of Zohar, going to mikveh, which is why you'll find that Chassidim, they go to mikveh every day, regardless or whatever it may be, very often, a few times a week, because you never go wrong with mikveh. Just do a lot of it. How much intent am I having when I'm going into the mikveh? That's not how it works. The mikveh has a tremendous power for men, and then women go, of course, when they need to go. And the last thing, most relevant to our discussion, is the giving of tzedakah. The giving of tzedakah, which of course fits very nicely with the example the Gemara gives, that ultimately, if a person gives tzedakah, no matter the purposes, the main thing is to give tzedakah and to give a lot of tzedakah. But this is a statement of the holy Baal Shem Tov. Okay, now to deal with the question that I raised before, which is, why does the Code of Jewish Law rule that it's so problematic to do something for arrogance, the hispar? And why does our Gemara take, and for the same price and the same reasoning, where's the source of that ruling? From our Gemara. So for the same price, we have to ask, what's the big deal that the non-Jews are doing it for pride and arrogance? What's the big deal? They're doing the right thing. The person's giving tzedakah. The kindness of the nations is a sin, is a chatos. What's the chatos? What's the chatos? What's the sin? What's the reason for that? So the truth is, this is not the first place that we find this. Elsewhere in the Gemara tells that one of the greatest philanthropists, the richest, the Montefiore, the Rothschild of the land of Israel, the richest man in the entire land of Israel, was a man by the name of Nakdimin ben Gurion, the first Ben Gurion. His name was Nakdimin ben Gurion. He lived through the time of the destruction of the temple. And his daughter ended up being a poverty-stricken woman who had nothing to eat, and the rabbis saw her picking out barley kernels out of animal feces at the side of the road. And they got into a discussion. Of course, they helped her, and they felt bad, especially her origins. They couldn't believe it, how she had fallen, her family, after the destruction of the temple. And they asked the question, why was his family punished, so to speak, that his daughter was reduced to this place that she's picking out these barley kernels from the side of the road in the mud. The Gemara gives two answers. The first answer of the Gemara is that he did it all for his own honor, which is exactly the concept we're discussing. It was for his covet. The second answer offered by the Gemara is that he gave a lot, but in comparison to what he was capable of giving, it was like he gave nothing. Even though he gave so much money, but for the money he has, each person is judged by their capabilities, which of course is a major lesson in life for all of us, nothing to do with tzedakah per se. A person can say, I'm accomplishing so much. Look at all the schleppers out there. The world is full of leidegayers. The world is full of untalented people. And look, I'm doing a lot. That's not how you're judged. You're judged based on your capability, how much you're capable of doing, not how much other people are doing and how much they're capable of doing. That's a different conversation. The Gemara says. As much as he was supposed to be giving and capable of giving, he didn't give. But zeroing in, focusing in on the answer of the Gemara, that he did it for his own honor. So the Marsha, of course, comes right in. The commentaries come in and they ask the question, I thought you should do a mitzvah, shalei lishma. So the Marsha wants to answer that, no. When do we say that regarding other shalei lishmas? Not for the sake of honor. Not for the sake of honor. Not for the sake of honor. The Hafla now asks, Rabbi Pinchas Horowitz, the chief rabbi of Frankfurt, became a chassid late in his life. He never used to express it publicly. He just clandestinely was a chassid throughout his life because he got a personal request from the head of Prague, from the Noid Yehuda, not to express himself as a chassid from the pulpit. The Noid Yehuda was personally an opponent to the movement of Chassidus, and he respected the request. The Pinchas Hafla, the Alter Rebbe, was very close to him. Very interesting man. So the Hafla asks, he says, I don't understand what you're saying. It says explicitly in many places that even if a person is doing something for his honor, it's okay. So he says that's not a good explanation. So what's the explanation? We have a direct contradiction here. Direct contradiction. The Gemara says that why was Akdimin Ben Gurion punished? Because the Chavay Yehuda Avad, it was for his covet. But elsewhere it says that even Shalai L'Shema. So he says like this. And I hope I'm quoting him accurately. His argument. He says there's two things. You could do it in order to get honor. You think people are going to respect you. You think people are going to look up to you. You think people are going to think that you're a very smart person and so on. That's okay. Why? Because we say that once you're already into learning, you're going to get smarter and you're going to realize that that's not the reason you should be learning. You're going to get the truth of Torah, and you're going to arrive at the point where it's going to be for the right reasons and so on. However, what if when the person is actually learning the Torah, that moment itself, he's learning out of arrogance? Not that he wants to get respect. He's right now, the act itself is the way he's priding himself over someone else. Maybe he's teaching a class, whatever it may be. The very act, as you're doing the Torah and the mitzvahs, you're doing it for the sake of arrogance. The whole act is one big act, is an expression of your arrogance. Just like when a person gives tzedakah for their arrogance, that's what he says. It's a very nuanced idea, which has to be thought about. Does it make any sense? This division that he's creating. And he says it's clear that way, because that's what it means, that if you use the crown of Torah, you get destroyed. You can't bring in your arrogance into the Torah. And he says, in general, the Talmud tells us that whoever's arrogant is like an idolater. So you're doing a mitzvah through a sin. The very mitzvah is a sin. He says, I don't see how it could be okay. And he says a lot of people make this mistake. They think that it's okay to engage in Judaism, engage in mitzvahs, engage in Torah for arrogance. He says that's not what the Gemara meant. When the Gemara says you'll get kavod, it didn't mean the arrogance from the Torah itself. It didn't mean that the very act of learning Torah was an arrogant act. That's what he says. And perhaps, so based on the haflah, perhaps that's what the code of Jewish law means as well. Not here to tell you not to give tzedakah, but if the act of giving tzedakah itself is a gleeful moment of arrogance and so on, that he says not only you're not getting rewarded for that, you'll get punished for it also. The more I think about it, the less I think it makes sense. But anyways, I have to think about it more. It's a pshat that he says. The distinction he's making is too subtle. It's too nuanced. It has to be thought about. To be honest with you, he's saying that. What's the difference? He's saying you do it in order to get kavod, or the act itself is misgah, is a person taking arrogance in the act. Anyways, if anyone has any thoughts about what he might mean, you could definitely chime in. But a final point for the evening, as we wrap up, and next time we'll continue the Gemara, is something that the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, founder of Chabad, said in his last few months of living, in the year 1812. He passed away in the year 1812. So in his last few months, he gave a maimer. He said over a speech, if we could call it that, a Hasidic discourse, and he discussed our piece of Gemara during that speech. It's printed in one of his many books, and it's from that year, the year 1812. He's reaching the end of his life, and he said he was dealing with this same question. Did somebody have a comment they wanted to make? Okay. He's dealing with this same question. Is it okay to do it for the sake of honor? Is it not okay to do it for the sake of honor? That's the struggle of today's conversation. You're doing a mitzvah, you're giving tzedakah, but it's all for kavod, it's all for ulterior motives. So the Alter Rebbe over there says on a level of pshat, a very simple explanation, but it's fascinating. He says that in the days, if you look in the Talmud, you'll see that they used to force all the needs of the poor of the community to be covered. It's an interesting concept. You have to figure out what the Jewish system would be for a country in general. But he says you force the needs to be met, the basic needs, not luxury, but food, clothing, shelter, and medical assistance. Everyone's needs have to be met, and we'll force the people who have the money to make sure that the basic needs of society are met. He says, however, says the Alter Rebbe over there in that talk, it would only give the basic necessities: bread to eat, clothing that you shouldn't be naked, right? However much, exactly as much as you need to live. Nothing, no pleasure, no nothing. So he says, when this person comes along and says that I'm giving this selah, this money to charity, he says, for sure, what you're doing is you're giving the poor people more than their need. Why? Because whatever you need in order for them to live, it's not your donation. No one asked you. It's going to be taken away from you by force. It's not a question of you being asked to do it. It's going to be forced out of you. So what it means is that you're giving beyond your obligation, in order that the poor person should be comfortable, not that she just survive. And of course, this is also a mitzvah. And so the Alter Rebbe says like this: what the person had to give in order to fulfill the mitzvah, in other words, that the poor person shouldn't die, that's the basic obligation, the basic core of the 613 commandments. That, he says, you do for the right reason. You do it because it's the will of Hashem. no ulterior motives. When it comes to fulfilling the will of God, the will of the Creator, the core of a mitzvah, you have to be very, very diligent about making sure that you should really work hard and to have a relationship with God and make it real. You're not doing it for ulterior motives. We're here for real. Life's not a joke. If everything's an ulterior motive, when is the moment of truth? When do you become a real person? It's a terrible thing to see a religious person who's living, who's either very egotistical, because everything's about him, my heaven, my this, my that. Everything, it's very negative. It's the opposite of everything Judaism is trying to capture, which is about losing yourself, connecting with the divine, with a greater reality. So you have to be very diligent. He says the core of the 630 mitzvahs, he does in order to fulfill the will of God without any ulterior motive. And that's what makes it. So he's a tzaddik gomer, he's a complete tzaddik. Tzaddik means you do it for the right reasons. He's giving this money, this selah for ulterior motives in order that his son should live, merit the world to come. He said that Alter Rebbe says over there, he said it's not a negative trait at all. On the contrary, the Gemara says you're called a tzaddik gomer. Why? Because this money you're giving is beyond the obligation. It's beyond the mitzvah given to you by the Torah. It's you decided to do something special and extra. And he says a big chiddush, a big novelty, that when you do something beyond normal, beyond what's expected, then it's mutter lechatchila, to use his words. It's permissible in the first scenario. It's okay to give it for your own good, whether physical or spiritual. He says it's not a negative thing. If you're going beyond, as long as you're doing the core of the mitzvahs of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Hashem, then additions and beautifications and things that you're not obligated in doing, there's no negative trait. The fact that there is an element of self, that's for yourself. So the Alter Rebbe took a new approach, and I think the reason why he was taking a new approach is because of some of the difficulties that we were discussing, and he was finding a way to sew the needle and work out all the pieces of Gemara. And I'll quote to you in conclusion all the Gemaras that we're struggling with. Nakdim and Ben Gurion, why was his daughter punished? Why was his family punished? Because the Chvay de David, he did it for his honor. This is quoted in the Code of Jewish Law, chapter Reish Samachtes. What we quoted from the Ramah, that a person who comes into the spar out of ego and pride gets punished for it. In our Gemara, the Gemara says the tzedakah and chesed of the goyim is a chatas, is a sin. But yet our Gemara says that a person gives money that his son should live or should get to the world to come. He's a tzaddik gomer, he's a completely righteous person. The Gemara in Pesachim says that for any mitzvah it's like that. The Gemara says in Pesachim a person should always learn Torah even for the wrong reasons, because he'll end up with the right reasons. How to fit all of this together? So the Alter Rebbe gave a novel explanation, but it doesn't deal with all the fundamental issues. But it's a novel idea that he proposes. We quoted a pshat of the Haflah. The Haflah wants to make a distinction between the fact that people will respect you eventually, versus the very act itself is a prideful and arrogant act. So that's some food for thought. I think we may have touched upon some other ideas, but we'll leave it for that. We've gone a little overtime today. And God willing, in Mirza Hashem, with Hashem's help, we'll be together next Wednesday, and we'll continue the Gemara. And the next piece of Gemara, we'll continue with the Gemara. And it's, of course, is all b'schus Avraham Shmuel ben Aryeh Leib for his neshama to have an aliyah.
Amen. Amen.
If anyone has any thoughts, questions, comments, agreements, you're allowed to as well. If you want to share, you're invited.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.